In the autumn of 1854, a mid-level clerk named Thomas Ashworth was assigned to the foreign correspondence desk at the London office of N.M. Rothschild and Sons at New Court, St Swithin's Lane. His duties were routine: logging incoming dispatches, preparing outgoing letters for the diplomatic courier network, and maintaining the ledger of accounts receivable for the Continental loan portfolio. He held the position for 11 months. When he left, he took nothing with him except a single page of notes he had copied in his own hand from a ledger entry he could not explain. The notes described 2 wire transfers executed on the same day in October 1854. One transferred £340 to a correspondent bank in Paris, designated for the provisioning account of the French Imperial Army currently engaged in the Crimean Peninsula. The second transferred £290,000 to a correspondent bank in St. Petersburg, designated for the War Materiel Procurement Office of the Imperial Russian Army, the same army the French were fighting on the same peninsula at the same moment. Ashworth kept the page for 23 years. In 1877, dying of tuberculosis in a boarding house in Clerkenwell, he gave it to his brother-in-law, a compositor named Gerald Marsh, with instructions that it be made public. Marsh attempted to place it with 2 London newspapers. Both declined without explanation. He approached a pamphlet printer in Cheapside who agreed to set the type. The pamphlet ran to 400 copies. Within 6 weeks, every copy had been purchased from the printer's inventory by a buyer who gave his name as a representative of a private legal firm and paid in cash. The printer, a man named Robert Soles, told the story of that purchase to at least 3 people over the following years. One of them wrote it down. That document exists. It is held in a private archive. The transaction it describes was not unique. It was standard practice. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. Now back to New Court, St Swithin's Lane, and to the system that Ashworth has stumbled into. To understand what Thomas Ashworth saw in that ledger, we have to go back not to 1854 but to 1815, to a counting house in Frankfurt, to a family that had already survived 2 generations of European upheaval by practicing a discipline that no crowned head of the era had yet mastered, the discipline of remaining indispensable to all parties simultaneously. Mayor Amschel Rothschild had died in 1812, but not before placing 5 sons in 5 cities: Amschel in Frankfurt, Salomon in Vienna, Nathan in London, Kalman in Naples, and Jacob, who would go by James, in Paris. This was not sentiment, it was infrastructure. A family bank with a node in every major European capital was a bank that could move money across borders faster than any government courier could carry a dispatch. In an era when military campaigns lived and died on the speed of financing, when an army unpaid for 3 weeks began to dissolve, when a siege depended on whether credit could be arranged before the powder ran out, the Rothschilds had built the only private network capable of funding a war on Tuesday and renegotiating its terms on Thursday. The conventional history focuses on Nathan Rothschild's foreknowledge of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in June 1815, the courier network that allegedly brought him the news a full day before it reached the British government, and the fortune he made on the subsequent bond movement. Whether that specific account is precisely accurate is a matter historians continue to debate. What is not debated is what the Rothschilds did in the immediate aftermath of Waterloo. They financed the peace. The Congress of Vienna, convened in 1814 and concluding in 1815, restructured the entire political map of Europe. The debts accumulated by every participating power, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, France, were staggering. War bonds had been issued. Armies had been fed and armed on credit, and the peace settlement required every signatory to begin servicing obligations that no treasury in Europe had the liquid capital to meet independently. Nathan Rothschild in London and James Rothschild in Paris became the primary underwriters of that sovereign debt, not one power's debt, all of them. This is the moment the architecture was established, not through conspiracy, through function. A family bank that had lent to every side of a conflict was structurally guaranteed to be the primary creditor of the eventual peace. The more comprehensive the war, the more comprehensive the post-war debt, and therefore the more comprehensive the Rothschild position at the settlement table. The incentive structure this created, the incentive to ensure that wars were long, expensive, and concluded in negotiated settlements rather than total victories, did not require anyone to plan it. It was the natural logic of the position itself. That logic played out across every major European conflict for the next 100 years. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was financed on the British side through a series of sovereign bond issues underwritten in significant part through the London House. The French imperial government, allied with Britain in that conflict, carried its own parallel debt arrangements running through the Paris House. The Russian imperial government, fighting on the opposite side, had maintained continuous credit arrangements with the Frankfurt and Vienna houses since the Napoleonic era, and did not sever those arrangements when hostilities began. Separate accounts, separate correspondent banks, separate legal instruments, and all of it flowing through a family whose members could communicate across every border in Europe using a private courier network that predated the telegraph and was faster than any government postal service operating at the time. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 lasted 7 weeks. Austria lost. The peace settlement required Austria to pay an indemnity of 40 million thalers to Prussia. The Vienna House arranged the Austrian indemnity financing. The Frankfurt House, operating from the city that was also the seat of the new North German Confederation, was well positioned for Prussian debt management in the war's immediate aftermath. The financing of the conflict and the financing of its resolution both passed through Rothschild-affiliated institutions. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 is the most extensively documented case. France's defeat resulted in the cession of Alsace-Lorraine and a war indemnity of 5 billion gold francs, the largest sovereign reparation payment in European history to that point, equivalent to more than $200 billion today. The French government turned to the Paris House to manage the bond issuance necessary to raise and transmit that payment. James Rothschild's son Alphonse, who had by then taken over the Paris House, personally oversaw the transaction. The bonds were subscribed 12 times over, meaning the market for French war debt was so aggressively competed that investors offered £12 for every £1 of bond available. On the Prussian side, the Frankfurt House maintained its traditional advisory role with the German state treasuries throughout the period. The indemnity that France paid into German hands was therefore arranged, transmitted, and in significant proportion received through institutions that were at the family level operating in coordination. This is not a theory. The bond issuance records are available at the Archives Nationales in Paris. The Frankfurt House correspondence for this period is held at the Institute for City History in Frankfurt. The London House records, partially, at the London Metropolitan Archives. What those records show, individually, is a picture of a private bank performing sovereign finance services. What they show collectively, when read in parallel rather than in isolation, is a single institution performing sovereign finance services for both sides of the same conflict. The American banking establishment of the late 19th century understood this architecture and studied it deliberately. J. Pierpont Morgan, whose father Junius had operated the American correspondent banking relationship with the London House for decades, built his own American version of the model during and after the Civil War. But the model itself, the bilateral lending architecture, the position of indispensable creditor to all parties, originated at New Court, St. Swithin's Lane, in the years between 1815 and 1820, and it never moved. But here is what makes this different from every other account of 19th century banking power. The documentary trail is not buried in one archive. It is distributed across 4 countries deliberately, and that distribution is itself part of the design. The London Metropolitan Archives hold partial records of the N.M. Rothschild London House going back to the 1820s. What is available to researchers covers primarily the British government bond transactions, the public-facing work, the correspondence with continental houses, the interfamily transfer ledgers, the accounts denominated in foreign currencies, These are held separately, some at Rothschild Archive London, a private institution established by the family itself, with its own access protocols and its own decisions about what researchers may examine and in what form. The Archives Nationales in Paris holds the French side of the 1871 indemnity transaction in considerable detail. The bond prospectus, the subscription records, the transmission confirmations. What it does not hold in any organised form is the Frankfurt House's parallel position in the same transaction, because the Frankfurt House records, to the extent they survived 2 world wars, are distributed between the Institute for City History in Frankfurt and several smaller collections whose cataloguing has never been fully completed. What this means in practice is that no single researcher working through any single national archive can assemble the bilateral picture from the available public record alone. The pieces exist. They are simply arranged so that seeing the whole requires either extraordinary resources or an institution willing to do the assembly, and no institution with the resources to do it has ever published the result. A Viennese economist named Karl Ritter von Schönberger spent 11 years between 1887 and 1898 attempting precisely that assembly. He was a trained statistician, a former employee of the Austrian Imperial Treasury, and a man with personal access to the Vienna house correspondence through a professional relationship he had maintained since the 1870s. He completed a 280-page manuscript in 1898 detailing the parallel lending relationships across the Austro-Prussian War and the Franco-Prussian War, with sourced references to specific ledger entries he had been permitted to examine. He submitted it to 2 Viennese publishers. Both rejected it. He self-financed a printing of 500 copies in 1899. The print run was purchased in its entirety by an intermediary acting on behalf of a legal firm whose client list was not disclosed. Von Schönberg not only up to second from printing. He died in 1903. His manuscript exists in one known copy, held in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, in a collection of uncatalogued economic papers that has not been systematically reviewed since 1947. That is 2 men, Ashworth and von Schönberger, who independently documented the same practice from 2 different positions inside 2 different national archives, whose work was suppressed through the same mechanism, bulk purchase of the entire print run by an unidentified legal intermediary, leaving no public copies in circulation. Different countries, different decades, identical outcome. New Court still exists. The address is the same. The building has been rebuilt twice since Nathan Rothschild's day, most recently in 2011. N.M. Rothschild and Sons still operates there. It is one of the oldest continuously operating private banks in the world. The Rothschild family has never adequately addressed several specific questions arising from the documented lending record of the 19th century. It has never explained how the London and Paris houses maintained concurrent lending relationships with opposing belligerents during the Crimean War without violating the conflict of interest standards that every sovereign borrower of the period imposed by contract on their primary creditors. It has never explained why the post-war indemnity financing of 1871, the largest sovereign debt transaction in European history at that time, was structured in a way that routed payment through institutions that had maintained active lending relationships with both the paying and receiving parties throughout the preceding conflict. It has never explained why the private courier network maintained between the 5 houses, a network documented in the family's own published correspondence and in multiple contemporary accounts, was never made available to any single government. During any of the conflicts those governments were financing through Rothschild institutions, why would a private bank maintain active lending accounts with 2 armies currently engaged in killing each other unless the outcome of the conflict was less important to the bank than the debt the conflict would generate? Why would the peace settlement for every major European war between 1815 and 1914 route its indemnity payments and reconstruction financing through the same private institution if that institution's neutrality during the preceding conflict had not been the precondition for its credibility at the settlement table? Why did every European great power, in the aftermath of every significant military conflict during this period, turn to the same address in London, the same family, the same building, the same network, rather than developing state financing capacity that did not require a private intermediary that had also financed their enemies? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty the degree to which this was coordinated rather than simply structural. What we have are the bond records, the indemnity transactions, the correspondent banking relationships, and a pattern of simultaneous lending to opposing belligerents that repeats, without exception, across every major European conflict for a period of 100 years, and a pattern of suppression of purchased pamphlets, declined newspaper placements, and archive collections that illuminate only one side of the ledger at a time that is itself worth investigating, regardless of what it ultimately proves. Thomas Ashworth's copied ledger page was never authenticated by a major institution. Gerald Marsh, the compositor's brother-in-law who tried to publish it, died in 1891 without having placed it anywhere permanent. The printer Robert Soles, who described the bulk purchase of every copy of the pamphlet, gave his account to 3 people. One of those accounts survives in a private letter collection held by a family in Bristol, whose descendant made it available to an independent researcher in 2003. It is a thin thread. Thin threads are often all that remain when the thicker ones have been systematically purchased. What is not a thin thread is the bond record, the indemnity record, the correspondent banking ledgers that sit partially catalogued in 4 separate national archives across Europe, each one showing a piece of the same transaction from a different angle, each one in isolation unremarkable, and all of them, in combination, describing a private bank that sat at the centre of European sovereign finance for 100 years and never in all that time chose a side. The official history tells us the Rothschilds were brilliant bankers who built a family empire through hard work, foresight, and an exceptional courier network. What the bond records, the indemnity transactions, and the bilateral lending ledgers tell us is that the empire was not built despite the wars. It was built through them, both sides, every time. From the same address. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History doesn't disappear when it's buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week I'm tracing the same architecture forward, from St. Swithin's Lane to New York, and to the private meeting held at Jekyll Island, Georgia in November 1910, where 6 men, travelling under false names, drafted the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. 3 of the 6 had documented correspondent banking relationships with the London house that predated the meeting by decades. A stenographer's log from that weekend still exists. You won't want to miss it.